And we're live. Woohoo!
We're
Yes.
back after 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Tim. It's been
Yes.
3 weeks since we've been live.
Yeah, and that's because it's because I was away in the US, and I'm sorry I cut Dave off there. He was going to say something profound.
I was going to say I should hold up a newspaper, shouldn't I, like a hostage, saying so that we know that it's definitely live, or certainly the right day. A newspaper and a clock as well. So
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Actually, maybe we should force the guests to do that
against their will. Yeah.
He's here against his will, friends. Let's see what he has to say.
Everything's fine. I am very happy. Tim and Christelle are treating me very well. I have no complaints.
So we've started with a hostage speech. Anyway, you are renowned. I've created a different graphic for just two of us in case we're still going and talking after Christelle has to leave. And there I put comedy legend down rather than comedian and comedy writer. It's actually spaced up. But you are, in some ways, a comedy legend, and you've been around in the alternative comedy scene in the UK for a long, long time. Not meaning to make you feel old or anything, but very briefly, for people who don't know who you are, what is the magic short bio of Dave Cohen in comedy?
Yes. Well, I suppose I was very lucky. I was around at the start of alternative comedy, which kind of grew out of the whole British punk rock scene of the late 1970s, and which then became the American punk scene. Well, I suppose it kind of came a little bit from America in the mid-70s, the New York Dolls and Velvet Underground, whatever. But the punk was an amazing thing in Britain. Apart from shocking lots of all the right people, it was actually really funny, and there was just a great humour to it. And a lot of the people who started then, people like sort of Rick Mail, Alexi Sale, and Jennifer Saunders, they were around at the start of punk, and then they started this thing at the Comedy Store in Britain in the late 1970s. I met them when they were students, complete unknowns, and then suddenly they all became massively famous. I was working as a journalist in South Wales thinking, oh no, I've blown it. So then I quit my job, moved to London in the early 80s. And again, I was very lucky because that was just the time that all these famous people had left these clubs. And so there were all these clubs in London, and lots of people coming and starting to play them. And that's where I met Mike Myers, who was working in Britain at the time. And with Mike and the British comedian Paul Merton, we started a thing called the Comedy Store Players. That's still going strong, nearly 40 years later. So yes, I worked as a stand-up comedian very happily for many years, and then moved into writing really after that, and wrote for lots of radio and TV comedy shows in Britain, BBC. And then in the last few years, mostly I've been writing songs for a kids' TV show called Horrible Histories, which was also made into a movie. And very luckily, I mean, happily, we picked up loads and loads of BAFTAs for that, which it was one of those shows that you just don't imagine. It's a kids' TV show making jokes about history. I mean, why would that become a huge success? I don't know, but it did.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic, and really loved working on that. And then more recently, I've been writing comedy because I'm a bit of a nerd, really.
Yeah.
I love to analyze things as well.
So
There you go.
you've had quite a history of, I don't even know where to begin with these questions. Let's start with alternative comedy. What exactly does, I know what alternative music is, but what is alternative comedy? What's the difference between alternative and
well,
other?
I suppose in the States in the 1970s, you had this kind of this growth of stand-up comedy. You had people like Lenny Bruce, and then Richard Pryor and George Carlin, and there was this kind of comedy with an edge compared to, say, what was more famous in the 50s and 60s, which was the comedy, the sort of New York Jewish Catskills comedy, very kind of very sort of establishment and bits misogynistic, a little bit racist. Henny Youngman, these sort of people, take my wife, please, ha ha ha, all that sort of stuff. And in Britain, we didn't have that, but we had very much a kind of a sort of music hall background. And again, it was a very old-fashioned sort of comedy. And the phrase alternative comedy came sort of out of punk. It was comedy, but it wasn't like the sort of stuff that we knew. It wasn't like anything that was on TV. And so it got called alternative because it was an alternative to what was on TV. And very quickly it became hugely popular and became mainstream, as happens to all successful alternative things. So like the best alternative music, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say alternative comedy in the UK is now really just comedy, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the alternative comedy would be, but maybe that'll come in 20 years or so. What was it like? I mean, I suppose I know the answer in a way because I've had enough dealings with like online celebrities and people, but a lot of the people you had dealings with them are now very famous. People like Mike Myers, as you say. Even Paul Merton is pretty famous. He's not so famous in the US as Mike Myers would be. But what was it like to have friends who did spectacularly well? Like they were household names. Most people would know who Mike Myers. Well, people would know Austin Powers anyway. They might not know Mike Myers. But what was it like to have friends who did so well? Was it something you were thinking like, why is that not happening to me? Or were you just really grateful that they did really well?
Well, to begin with, that was the feeling. As I say, I met Rick Mail when he was a student. We were both students in the late 1970s. And then within 3 years, he was like a big TV star. And I was still working, as I say, as a journalist. And I thought, and my thoughts then as a naive 20-something was, oh, somebody who does what I like doing is really famous. I'd better go and get back in touch with him and see if I can sort of get in on his coattails, because you just didn't have a clue what you were doing at that time. And he was lovely. He was really famous, but he took time out and he'd come and meet me, and we met in a couple of pubs in North London and Camden and Islington, and each time we met, over a sort of year and a half period, by the time I sort of saw him for the third or fourth time, I mean, it was impossible to have a conversation because everybody was just coming up to him all the time. He was so loved, and he remained loved, right up to his very sad and untimely death in his 50s. And that was, he had that fantastic kind of natural affinity. He could be a hilariously funny person to be around, but then he could also be kind around, strangers, and people come up to him. And I mean, there weren't smartphones or anything then, but they asked for his autograph, and he was just really great about it. But at that point, I started to think, oh, blimey, is this something that I want for myself? And I sort of wasn't quite sure. Anyway, 2-3 years later, we're all kind of we're basically a gang of unknowns. So Mike Myers is just one of the guys doing stand-up comedy. Paul Merton, Harry Enfield, Joe Brand, these were people who very successful British comedians. We were kind of a small disparate group, and I mean, everybody knew Mike was out of our stratosphere, really. I mean, he completely shook our little world up. We were a very sort of English plus sort of Irish Catholic, I suppose, and Jewish, but we were kind of a small group, and we were playing in pubs, and it was all fine, and we were just earning enough money to kind of get by and do a few more of these pub gigs. And then Mike came along, and audiences were just, it just took off to a new level. And we actually started to say, oh, this is what you do. So it was from that point of view, it was like it professionalized us, I think. it stopped us being like the village idiots and made us go, oh, right, you work really hard at this and you do it and you get better and better. And I mean, no one of us could have predicted how massively successful Mike then went on to become once he quit Britain, went to Saturday Night Live, and then within a few years of that, Wayne's World, I think, had come out, and then the Austin Powers movies. So none of us could have predicted that sort of level. But even within Britain, so the whole alternative thing started to become, as I say, more mainstream. These people were just really, really good at what they did, and so it was great in terms of it kind of raised the level for all of us. But I think then once people started to become very famous, I started to think maybe that's not where I'm heading, and maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah.
Wow. So you did journalism before comedy. How was this? Were you doing journalism throughout your comedy career, or did you do a mass switch between journalism and comedy? What does that even look like?
Yeah, I sort of knew I wanted to write, and I didn't really know how to do that. I didn't understand anything about showbiz or that people wrote comedy scripts or the process. I sort of had a little sense of it, but I didn't really. I thought, okay, if you want to be a writer, you probably have to get some sort of writing job. So I trained as a journalist. And I found that really helpful, actually, because being a journalist is the most brilliant thing about being a journalist for any job is deadlines. You have to, you go and you go to court and you watch a court case and you've got an hour to write what you've seen and get the newspaper. And that's really helpful if you're writing comedy, especially for topical shows, because they need sketches and we need it now and we need it there. And so the ability to write to deadlines is a really useful skill that I picked up. And then I sort of carried on a little bit doing journalism here and there, bits of writing, but it was sort of so much easier to just do 3 or 4 gigs a week and hang out and have fun the rest of the time. I couldn't really it's so much work trying to pitch ideas for journalism, and then I just thought I'll just hang out with my mates and we'll go and watch comedy shows. We'll go and watch each other's comedy shows when we're not performing, and hang out together and sit in the park and play football or whatever. So I kind of took a bit of a break from doing proper work when I was a stand-up.
Yeah. So you've now got several books out, but you've got at least one new recent book that you've written about teaching people how to write comedy. So here's your chance. Talk about your book and why you wrote that book, and how people can find it if they're interested.
Yeah. So this is the book, The Complete Comedy Writer. So it covers everything. It was initially when I started out writing comedy, it was relatively straightforward that you went into the BBC and you walked in and there were these very charming chaps. It was all men, and they'd all been to Oxford or Cambridge University. Terribly charming, very nice people. And there was little me, northern Jewish bloke with no understanding of how the world works, and thought, wow, this is amazing. What am I doing here? And they said, oh, you write these sketches and things. And so you went in and there was no security guards stopping you or anything. And you wrote for these topical weekly shows, and then somebody would like what you wrote, and the producer would say, here, I've got another show here. I'm doing this. And that was the process for probably 30 or 40 years, was how you become a comedy writer in Britain. You start at the BBC and you get trained and you get better at it. But that's when I wrote the first edition of this in 2018. That was kind of the gist of it, was that's how you become a comedy writer. But since then, and not just COVID, but just generally, the BBC's been cut and cut and cut, and there are fewer slots now for comedy shows on TV and even on the streaming sites, and it's a lot harder to get in and make a living. So this book is more about the craft. How do you become a better writer? How do you write comedy? And I talk about things like finding your comedy voice, and that's Mel, by the way, for those of you who are wondering who is Mel, my absolute comedy hero, Mel Brooks. And he's really the reason that I got into any form of comedy at all. I think really I was about 13 or 14 years old, I think, and the original film, The Producers from 1967 was on the TV on a Sunday afternoon. And I'd never seen anything like it. I had never laughed so much at a film in my life. I mean, I was in physical pain by the end of watching The Producers. I laughed so much. I found it so funny. And I kind of only realized maybe in the last year or so, 40, 50 years later, that actually I've spent my whole career trying to be Mel Brooks.
Yeah.
That's my voice. My comedy voice is an English version of Mel Brooks, and it's it doesn't really that's kind of all I've ever aspired to, really. And I suppose a lot of this book is about finding your voice, who you are, and how to use that, and how to set you aside from other writers. And then it's more about the craft of how you come up with characters and stories and all those sort of areas as well.
So, Dave, what makes someone funny? And I have to say this because my husband being British and me being American, we all know the saying that Americans don't get British humor and that kind of thing. And we have conversations about that. But regardless, what makes someone funny? What makes something funny?
Yeah, that's interesting. And the answer to that has changed. I talk a little bit about that in the book about, American comedy and British comedy. And you used to be able to say, right, British comedy is all about lovable losers, disappointment, melancholy. These are the sort of downtrodden characters who are just completely useless losers. And there's a man called Dennis Norden, who's a very famous British comedy writer. He defines the joke. What is a joke? He says all jokes are the momentary removal of sympathy. And that applies to anything. So it's funny when Laurel and Hardy fall flat on their backsides. We laugh because we're laughing at the fact that it's them, and it's a momentary removal of sympathy. If it was us, we'd go, ow, that hurt. Or if it was somebody we knew, we go, oh dear, that's a shame. But because it's them, we laugh. So it's that removal of sympathy from characters. That's what makes things happen that make us laugh. Then we used to say, "Oh, the Americans, you don't have losers in American comedy. They're all kind of winners and things." But it's more about the kind of American comedy is more about the sort of differences in relationships, differences between men and women, and differences between races and faiths and those sorts of things. But I think it's changed a lot. There's been a blurring, really, and American TV loves British losers. And it's kind of taken them on board and has built its own comedy shows that are very kind of influenced by British humor, like the American Office, for instance, which is hugely influenced by the UK version of that show. And the whole of the internet really was basically influenced by one man, a British comedy writer called Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which basically invents this sort of comedy thing that is basically the internet. and so kind of the people who run America now, maybe not so much in the last few weeks, but the sort of Silicon Valley kind of attitude is very much inspired by the sort of British surreal comedy of the 1970s and 80s. So I think you and your husband might find you've got more things that you laugh about together than you would have done, say, if you'd met 30 years ago.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the history of comedy, as in I've heard like you never see any Charlie Chaplin films on TV anymore, and I've heard a couple of explanations why this happens. One, that it's all massively racist and misogynistic and the rest of it. But the other more mundane answer is people don't find it funny anymore.
Yeah.
Would you say that like watching comedy from like 100 years ago or 50 years ago, 20 years ago, that we would find it progressively less funny? And is there anything coming up new that you think is going to be like the new wave of comedy? Is like, are there any acts and things out there you see and think, oh, that's interesting, that's new?
Yeah, I think comedy, it goes through phases, always goes through phases, really. And I think, I know people don't watch Charlie Chaplin films so much anymore, but they'll still go and see. I mean, people watch Succession, which is like a TV show, which is basically King Lear, so that's like a 400, 500-year-old story. And Shakespeare's stories are all nicked from the Greeks anyway, so there's probably a Greek version of King Lear that I don't know about.
Yeah.
And so these things are sort of cyclical, I think. But I think one of the key things, the interesting things, is how comedy catches up with technology. And so when Charlie Chaplin films came out, and film was still a kind of relatively new technology, and I'm thinking about some of the stunts and thinking about Buster Keaton as well, and you look at these stunts and it's like, this man's just standing here and a house falls on top of him, but just he's standing there and it just fell when the one open window fell on him, and it's like, wow, that is just it's just incredible. And you'll go to, I mean, if you'll see that clip over and over again and love it, but then go to the cinema and watch the whole film, and there'll be like 7 or 8 set pieces like that of like a few seconds each, and an hour and a half of kind of stuff that isn't quite as it's just very slow. It takes a while to catch up. And I think so. To answer the next part of your question, to say, well, what's coming up? Stuff comes and goes, stuff goes in cycles. But I think that comedy is comedians and comedy is kind of very well suited to streaming, short attention spans, creating very short videos with like one big funny moment. And I was actually at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival last summer, and it was the first one since COVID, but it was amazing. I mean, there were way more stand-up comedians than there was an audience to see them. So a lot of even very successful stand-up comedians were not getting audiences. And I do think that thing that we called alternative comedy, I'm not saying it's finished, but it feels like it's sort of at a plateau. Whereas the shows that were really successful, the people who were really good, were actors or performers who could do like a 30-second sketch and be a character. And they didn't have to be great actors. It could just be, I'm this character, and it is me really, but it's got a funny script, and there's a little punchline here, and there's a joke here, and boom, and out. And the successful people who do that are getting millions and millions of hits across the world, and so massive audiences for those people. And I think we're going to see more of that kind of massive success, online success.
Who is your favorite comedian to watch right now, Dave?
Oh, that's an interesting question. He said, thinking, I haven't watched a comedian for so long now.
Who was?
Well, my favorite comedian was always a man who sadly never got the credit he deserved, really. I would say he was the original alternative comedian. He was so original, he was ahead of his time, and it was, the audiences weren't ready for him, but then the audiences were ready and he came through. And that's a guy called John Dowie, who was like probably the funniest British stand-up that I've seen. I mean, I can still watch British comedians like Harry Hill, and Harry Hill will just reduce me to tears, of laughter while I'm watching him. And he's been doing that for 35 years now. And I quite like, I do like a lot of the new young people coming through, but I'd hate to sort of pick somebody out because I just don't watch enough stand-up comedy anymore. I watch a lot of sitcoms. There's a fantastic new British sitcom called Black Ops, which I really like. And, I like a lot of the sort of more recent American sitcoms, like sort of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Good Place, and that's just a lot of those sort of shows. But yeah, I haven't really seen a stand-up who has excited me and made me go, "Ooh, this is really interesting." But that's my fault, I think. I'm not saying there aren't those people out there.
Okay, so I'm so tempted to ask another question, but no, Christelle's got to leave in a minute. How can people find out about you, and how can people find the books or any of the other? Because there's so much other stuff we could talk about. Talk about you wrote episodes of Spitting Image and that kind of stuff. But how can people find out about you, and how can people buy your books?
Well, you go to davecohen.org.uk, and that's where you'll find out all about my sort of comedy writing, how to write comedy. And it's not just how to be a comedy writer, it's also, if say you write fiction and you want to add a bit of comedy to your fiction, there's some hints, there's some stuff in there that would be helpful for that. And I've started to write the novels that I'm writing are kind of cover a lot of the stuff we've talked about. They're set in the first one is set in that sort of those early days of alternative comedy. And the second one is the next section of that when they all become really famous. So, and that's coming out in October. So that's under my author pseudonym that I had to use, David J. Cohen, as opposed to Dave Cohen. But you can find my novel Stand Up Barry Goldman under David J. Cohen, available at all good computers. And so the Complete Comedy Writer, I say you can get that. Go to davecohen.org.uk and find out more about me rabbiting on about comedy, which I love to do.
That's brilliant. Dave, thank you so much for chatting with us. This was fun, and I can't wait to share this with some of my friends in England, actually, and across the States. But I think I've had a lot of conversations with British friends about comedy and the difference, and they've introduced me to so many things. So this is really fun to chat with you and hear your perspective. Really, really fun. Thank you for being with us.
Well, and thank you. And I hope you enjoy the lovely British weather, when you come from your miserable San Diego with its, I don't know, lovely sunshine and stuff.
70 degrees there all the time.
It's awful here. It's 80 degrees. I hate it.
Terrible.
Thanks a lot, Dave, and thanks to anybody watching probably the replay on YouTube. And anybody who's just randomly skipped on this onto YouTube, just thank you for watching the whole show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Bye, everyone.
This is what God requires.